My name is David Tomasi from More Australia, the More global leader of the Energy, Mining and Renewable Sector Group. I'm your moderator for the session entitled ESG, Delivering the Caring Dividend. ESG is certainly an acronym that has been bandied around at the moment, but what does it actually mean? Whilst there are regulatory and compliance aspects, true ESG is anything but. Joining me today are 4 ESG directors from around the More Global Network. Mary Tressel from Armanino in California, Mark Selway from More Kingston Smith, London, Kylie Ma from More Australia, and Christine Eder from More Interaudit Austria. They will be discussing frameworks to drive change and outline real ways to make a difference. Along the way, we also hope to unpack a little more around what ESG means, demonstrate what we can all do to have social impact, and ultimately do our bit to help deliver the caring dividend. Mary, as you will be unpacking the environmental aspect, I will start with you. Given it has been famously said, it is not easy being green, how do you see the transition to being green, and what do frameworks need to address on the way to a sustainable roadmap?
Thank you, David. And you're right. For the energy, mining, and renewables industry, it's not always to be green. But the sector is really waking up to the benefits of focusing on the environment. For instance, ExxonMobil shareholders elected activist board members who want the oil giant to prepare for a post-fossil fuel world. Mining companies are trying to tap into the flood of cash targeting green investments by touting their production of materials that go into wind turbines, power lines, and batteries. And JP Morgan Chase announced the release of its first green bond annual report. They directed the proceeds of these bonds into renewable energy projects across the US, and that enabled the annual avoidance of over 4.7 million tons of CO2 emissions. So you can see there's real work being done here. But for EMR, the transition to green will not be overnight. We recommend taking a balanced approach that can achieve both cost savings today and environmental benefit for the future. Important here is to establish a strategic plan and roadmap that will be key to accomplishing a clean transition while driving down your operating expenses. There are opportunities for clean technology government grants and tax credits to support your capital expenditures and improve your ROI. So we really look to seeing more public and private partnerships to accelerate the efforts to focus on the environment. You should be aware that the common ESG frameworks in the EMR industry include the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Standard & Poor's ESG Risk Atlas, SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. So all ESG frameworks address Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. What are they? So Scope 1 emissions are emissions that you control, including your company fleet of cars or trucks. Scope 2 is purchased electricity and heat and steam to run your operations. And Scope 3 includes both upstream and downstream emissions, like business travel and purchased goods and services. When your organization's strategic plan is tied to an ESG framework like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals roadmap, your leadership team is going to focus on developing a stakeholder partnership plan that aligns your strategic business goals with business partners that can help advance those goals. It's also going to create a set of short-term, midterm, and long-term initiatives to ensure you capture benefits from early wins and position your company for success in larger CapEx investments that are going to yield lifecycle cost savings for the future. So thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Mary. Reinforces the need to take a balanced approach and the need to have a strategic framework to work to. Mark, your turn next. How do you see the social piece being developed? Effectively, how do we put the S into ESG?
So I'm excited to talk to you about putting the S in ESG because we get to talk about something more than just money. And it's something passionate and close to my heart because, we all can value things in terms of money, but how do we value things like the environment and the well-being of green spaces? How do we value things like the rights of the communities we work with? How do we put a price on relationships, supply chains, all of these things that actually are quite difficult to measure? So we tend to just measure the financial, but not the social, which is much bigger. So in the world that I live in, and the professionals that I work with, we're quite adept at telling the social story. We like to talk about a chain, yeah, starting from the input and the activities we do. So, in other words, the resources we use and the activities we undertake, through to the outputs that creates, the outcomes, i.e., the change that makes in the world, and then the impact that is the wider and sum change of everything we do. And remember, impact can be negative as well as positive. So, impact really is what you do to the world and the change you create in the world, both positive and negative. So, let's give an example. In the mining communities that you work with in the mining sector, the inputs would be the money and time you spend working with communities and helping the communities that you work with. The activities, for example, would be developing those communities and making them stronger. The outputs would be access to education, access to water, access to food and nutrition. But the outcomes, the change that you create, i.e., the greater skills, the greater well being, the resilience of communities, and the greater rights, that's really powerful. And so, if you think about the overall impact, more productive workforce, greater community well being, greater self determination, better access to basic rights, the value of that is incredible. Yeah. And probably many times the actual financial value. So putting the S in ESG is quite complex. And I like to think about it as the tip of the iceberg. I like to think about ESG and valuing the social as the finance just being at the top of the iceberg, but all of this change we create sitting underneath it. And that's really much more powerful than just the financials. So organizations like Anglo American realized this years ago. So Unilever, Anglo American, they've been pioneers in this area for years. And Anglo American, I spent 2 weeks, 1 week in Barcelona and 1 week in Singapore. And what we did was we looked at communities and how by building stronger communities and by working with communities, they could actually have better employees, a more stable workforce, a workforce that was happier with more well-being, which was actually productive for them. And it's interesting in the social investment work I've done, what we're seeing is that if you make a social investment per se, it's creating more social value than we thought, and also creating a financial return. So there's a really good case here for those organizations and corporates that are able to engage with the social are going to create more money. Yeah. So in terms of ESG, and let's bring in the S into ESG, we've all heard of the sustainability goals, and these are the UN sustainability goals. And these are really, if you like, they're not binding, but at the same time, they are ambitions that we should aim towards. And social sits throughout that, through education, through, the environment, through water, etc. But on the other side, we've got reporting frameworks that are being put in place across the world, like the FTSE in London, the Financial Times Stock Exchange, the main ratings of, I think it's all of the FTSEs and about 900,000 organizations across the world. There are 270 data points you have to record around things like well-being, diversity, your environmental impact, etc. And these are published. And so what you've actually got at the moment is some soft measures like the UN sustainability goals, but some hard measures like the ratings agencies are collecting, and you're being judged on that. Now, the social sits throughout that. Social Value International, there's already well documented ways of recording and talking about social value. And I've put down the bottom here the charities SORP as well. So charities where I tend to work, have actually been articulating the social for years, because it's the change they bring about with the beneficiaries and the stakeholders they work with. So I'm really excited in that public sector and charities have been doing this for years. The commercial sector can now start to learn from us, and I can see this real crossover happening. There are more social organizations now being built in the world than commercial organizations. So now is our time to think about social. And remember, if it can make you more money and a better workforce, that's really powerful. Which leads me through to the final thing I wanted to say. This can't just be a tick box exercise. You can always record the data points and just tick off, I don't know, having a diversity policy, but what does it actually change? What does it bring about in terms of change? And so, if you think about this diagram on the right-hand side, if we don't actually measure the social change, we don't measure impact, it just becomes totally a tick box exercise, and it doesn't really tell you very much about how you're changing. But in terms of the More Network, we've already developed a social framework, and we like to look at the evidence of change. In other words, how significant is it? How does it link to stakeholder groups? Do we have multiple sources of evidence? And then what we're looking at is the long-lasting change. In other words, does it represent significant movement? And does it have a lasting duration? And what about those other things like the negatives you bring into the world? Or could actually that change not be due to you and your organization, but due to something else? Yeah, we call that deadweight and attribution. So the S in ESG for me is pretty profound. It's much larger than just money, and it's moving very, very rapidly. I hope, David, that's been a very quick journey through the S in ESG. Would love to talk about it more.
Thanks, Mark. A great summary there. And obviously a big focus from you on the social outcomes aspect, and how it's no longer just about the bottom line, but also about thinking more deeply in what we're delivering as we put that S into ESG, as you say.
And David, just one final thought from me. They're now talking about the triple bottom line, which is the social, the environmental, and the financial. So actually, we're talking now triple bottom line organizations.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Mark. Kylie, over to you for the governance angle. And I'm very interested to hear what you can tell us about the attitude boards, and individuals for that matter, need to consider as they seek to embed, engage, and evolve the longer-term optimisation of the sustainability of their organisations. Kylie?
Yes, David, thank you. Yeah, sustainability has been a key focus of boards and executive for many years, with the focus, though, of the effort being on target setting, reporting obligations, and achieving compliance. The resourcing, the assurance, and the spend have all been really applied in the majority of the cases to reporting accuracy. So the question is that what will drive real change? Expectations are changing fast, and organisations need to meet these expectations for their own sustainability. So the three pillars of sustainability are environmental, social, and governance, ESG. And it is critical for organisations to focus on all three across all elements of their operations. A regulator-led approach to ESG is what we are currently seeing in the majority of organisations, and it doesn't make for good strategy. Compliance-focused, tick-the-box ESG, as Mark said, won't deliver your outcomes. We're seeing this failure clearly in Australia in 2021. We had Rio Tinto accidentally mine the sacred Indigenous caves. We have, for the first time, a large legal class actions just commenced against Australia's largest bank, the Commonwealth Bank, for their continual failure to deliver on their ESG targets. And we're seeing mounting evidence of the financial and workforce impacts in many organisations where they have not prioritised ESG. These organisations are the ones that did in the past spend big on sustainability, but sustainability compliance and reporting. The expectations have changed in ESG. The community is expecting more, your investors are demanding more, and your employees will leave for more. So therefore, ESG has to be prioritised, and it has to be aligned. It needs to be aligned across strategy, across governance, engagement, and your culture. To do this, you need to invest in monitoring and enabling and alerting tools so that you can prioritise and flag where you're seeing emerging and escalating ESG risks and to mitigate and respond so you can realign to achieve your outcomes. Your ESG framework needs to be embedded and evolving beyond compliance. Some of the questions that we think boards should ask themselves to challenge that they do have a mature framework and they are proactive are questions like, have you set your ESG risk appetite? Do you have an ESG governance committee that's providing focused oversight? Are you seeking innovation, staff participation, and client voice in defining your ESG strategy? Have you invested in those ESG enabling tools? Are all your stakeholders aligned and engaged on your ESG priorities? Have you actually defined your ESG outcomes and your tolerances in a way that guides escalation and monitoring? Are you assuring on your ESG controls and frameworks and not just on your reporting content? And finally, is your reporting designed for compliance or is it telling the real story? At Moore, we've collaborated globally to build and define an ESG maturity framework. It's a framework that can assess your current state, can identify gaps and opportunities, and define work plans to embed and engage and evolve. We've built this framework together with collaboration from all countries and learning from many failures and successes in ESG. It's a risk-based framework and it's designed for achieving ESG outcomes. We deliver this in many ways as a health check, just to see how mature your framework is, as a readiness assessment for transformational change, or as a maturity map to give you a detailed work plan to continue to mature. So we can provide these roadmaps to evolve and embed. And it's important that you are looking at your target future state, that you're looking to optimise all elements of your ESG. So delivery of long-term sustainability is the goal. But David, what we really want to see is real change. Real change is what we need in environmental, social and governance outcomes, and real change to see those outcomes being delivered.
Thanks very much for that insight, Kylie. I'm sure there are many people out there, like myself, that are very interested in your views on how they need to navigate from here, as well as how they might address the challenging questions you have put forward. Finally, last but not least, Christine. Europe seems to be ahead of the pack when it comes to the regulatory and compliance structures around ESG. What can you tell us about how they have evolved and where they look like they're heading?
David, in Europe, sustainability reporting is really changing. What I can see as an auditor here during the last decades, annual reports are very much focused on core financial information based on the financial statements and only supplemented by additional key figures presented in the notes and the management report. In recent times, it's really changing. The European Union emerged as a front runner for fundamental sustainable change, aiming to be climate neutral by 2050 and becoming an economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see on my first slide, as a strong sign, the European Union committed itself to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, such as no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, to name a few. They were set in 2015 by the international community as part of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainability Development Worldwide. And since then, the European Union included these SDGs in all its policies to evolve sustainability in every investment and finance process within the European Union. And what we can see here, they are focusing on 3 goals within these SDGs. As Mark and Kylie mentioned before, the environmental, social, and governance goals, the ESGs. Following the Accounting Directive in 2013, the European Commission introduced the Non-Financial Reporting Directive in 2014, the NFRD, and its disclosure rules for non-financial and diversity information in annual reports of large public interested entities with more than 500 employees since 2017. And David, you have to imagine this applies to more than 11,000 large companies and groups within the Union. So since 2017, the number of companies that publish sustainability reports has been growing steadily. And this is why we are getting so involved in helping our clients to set their ESG goals right. Within its scope, the NFRD requires companies to disclose together with the management report non-financial information such as environmental matters, social matters, the fight against corruption, privacy, and together defined features to assess a company's sustainable performance. And in April 2021, there was a really big change as the European Commission drafted a proposal for the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. The draft represents a substantial increase of the scope of sustainability reporting, as it now requires all large companies, based on size criteria, in addition to all companies listed on the regular market, except micro enterprises. As far as estimates go, this directive, if issued as drafted, will directly apply to more than 50,000 companies within the European Union. The reported information will become more reliable as the CSRD will require these reports to be audited, starting with the financial year 2023. And it even will become more comparable as companies will be required to digitally tag the reported information to be machine readable and feed into the European single access point for financial and non-financial information, publicly disclosed by companies. At the same time, EFRAG will become the new sustainability standard setter within the European Union. And on the IFRS level, in 2021, the IFRS Foundation also published an exposure draft to establish an International Sustainability Standard Board, the ISSB, to set IFRS sustainability standards alongside the International Accounting Standard Board, ensuring an agreed development of international accounting and sustainability-related requirements. And David, this will have a major impact and an influence in Europe, as these global sustainability standard setters will coordinate and continue to work existing international frameworks such as the Global Reporting Initiative already set up. So the sustainability strategy of the European Union has a major impact on fulfilling the ESGs within the European Union. And from my point of view, it enables investors to make informed choices, not only based on financial key figures, as we are used to, but also on ESG issues. For example, when making credit decisions, banks will assess whether companies have implemented a sustainable business strategy. And European regulators will assess threats to financial systems based on sustainability-related risks. So within the European Union, you can see that the mindset of people is changing. Corporates not only start to live sustainability, they start to align their profit-based business strategy with environmental and social goals, including the ESGs in their business strategy, risk management, and reporting to show stakeholders their sustainable value. So what are the next steps for corporates? We at Moore, we really try to help corporates to set up their sustainability risk management. If your company wants to be sustainable, the first thing you have to do, as Mark mentioned, live the ESG goals. Then update your profile based on business model to a more sustainable business model and identify if you're developing new sustainable technologies or reducing costs through optimizing the uses of environmental or social resources. Then build an ESG management system that allows you to manage your sustainable risks and set up controls to avoid negative impacts on these matters. And last but not least, enrich your financial reportings to your stakeholders with your way of fulfilling the ESG goals, including a brief description of your business model, your policies in use, and the material risks that are likely to have a negative impact on these matters and the controls to mitigate them. As more inter-audit, we believe that the linkage between managing the ESG risk and fulfilling the ESG goals as a corporate on the long run will have a huge impact not only on the planet and future generations, but it also will create a long-term sustainability value. Thank you, David.
Thanks heaps, Christine. ESG is certainly a journey which is not yet finished, but an important message to take away from the session is not just to be led by regulation, but to make sure we have a sustainable framework in place which we are living and breathing throughout all aspects of business, especially as we start to be subject to compliance and auditing requirements of ESG. Well, that wraps up the session on ESG. If you do need any further guidance with respect to frameworks or even how to start your ESG journey, please make contact. If nothing else, we hope we were able to provide more insight into the world of ESG and what we all need to think about if we are serious in delivering the caring dividend. Thank you all for joining in and listening.